start sharing my screen so that people can see that you did actually join the right session. Thanks very much for doing that. And this is, of course, ISACA South Florida's Privacy During the Pandemic live webinar, June 12th, 2020. We're thrilled to have you. And it's going to be a great session. There's a lot of effort that went on in the back end to sort of put this thing together. Some of you who have been members of ISACA and or members of the community for many years, you actually know that typically in June, we do something called our GRC conference, our GRC event. This is an event that we look forward to very much, and an event that has been a great success over the past few years. And because we're all right now dealing with the alternative physical scenarios, right? We're dealing with physical distancing, we're dealing with remote work, we're dealing with virtual environments and virtual participation in trainings like this. We're exploring and finding new ways to continue to bring you valuable content, to continue to engage with you, to interact with you, to receive your feedback, and to provide you this type of valuable training and information to our ISACA members, our ISACA community, the broader community, South Florida at large. Of course, since we also advertise this on social media and online, we know that there are people from other ISACA chapters who have registered and are able to join as well. So welcome all. And of course, welcome to our corporate partners and sponsors. Welcome to students who are also joining the session. We're thrilled to have all of you. It's going to be a great session. And so with that, I'll go ahead and kind of start to get into some of the welcome and a little bit of the high level agenda of what we're going to be covering today. There's some questions that are coming in and comments and that sort of thing about functionality, whether or not you can turn on and off the video, that sort of thing. Yes, of course you can. You are welcome to join this session in whatever way is most effective for you. Just as a reminder, as I was kind of commenting a moment ago, this will be actually a fairly engaging and interactive session. We are going to be asking you some questions and receiving your input. So if you are able to join in a web browser or in the full client, then you'll probably get the richest experience out of this. But regardless of which manner you're able to join, you're very welcome to be here. We're thrilled to have you, and we're excited to get started. So as I do, one thing that I want to make sure that I don't forget is to thank the people who put a lot of time, effort, and energy into initially planning an outlook for a GRC event, then being very agile, very flexible, and very responsive to convert this to a panel event, switch to the online domain, that sort of thing. Those people include the entire committee, but especially with us here today is, of course, our Director of Programming, Sandra Paras, who I'm sure you know from a long time of experience here in ISACA. Thank you very much, Sandra, for all your help in putting this together. We're extremely grateful. Joanne Clipper is another member of that committee who also happens to be joining us as a co-host today. Thank you very much, Joanne, for all of your effort. Lynn Cotton, a director at large, also a member of the committee responsible for planning this event, also here with us today as a co-host. Thank you very much, Lynn, for your help in planning this event. And then, like I'm saying, there was an entire committee behind this effort who also was involved in strategizing, making sure that we're addressing the topics that you want to hear. And specifically to that note, it was just over a month ago, actually, that we had our annual general meeting where we went over some business, we gave a number of polls, we received feedback from you, and we saw that when we asked you about the topics that you wanted to hear about and that were important to you, something that was very conspicuous was that the top issue that you were interested in hearing about in the next 12 months of this fiscal year was privacy, compliance, and regulations and issues in data privacy and security. And in response to that, it just so happens, they say They say luck is when opportunity meets preparedness. It just so happens that we were actually kind of already working and brainstorming to put together this panel anyhow and figuring out how to make that happen. And when we saw that validation through your response and your feedback, we became especially excited about making this happen. And we're thrilled that we can talk to you about this subject today. You're going to hear from a great panel, and at the same time, you're going to receive some very good information about the latest credential that ISACA International has brought forth to the marketplace, and that is the CDPSE, the Certified Data Privacy Solutions Engineer credential. I'm going to give a very brief overview of that before the panel starts, and then after the panel gets a chance to present and respond to your questions, then we'll actually go into the specific domains of knowledge requirements that are required for this certification. So that will come after the panel. And then we'll talk about additionally some information about actually how to apply for that. And specifically in relation to your response to our panel, to your interest, you focusing in on this issue, ISACA International is also very focused on this issue. Privacy regulations, privacy compliance, the security of private information, because there have been a number of trends in the past 10 years that have been really driving this issue, that 65% of the world population is now covered under modern privacy regulations, or will be by 2023. And that's up from previously only 10% of the world's population being covered by this specific type of regulation. So you can see there's been a dramatic increase in the importance in regulatory environments and in culture, quite frankly, for this issue. And of course, the response from ISACA. There are 80 countries around the world that have enacted some type of privacy law to date. And there are 43% of respondents to an ISACA International poll that say that in their organization, there is some missed detection of personal information turning out to be a common privacy failure. And that is, they have some personal information that should be subject to certain types of safeguards and compliance considerations and requirements. And they're actually failing to identify even that information. So it shows you how acute the attention is that needs to be paid to this topic and how relevant it is. And so, like I said, after the panel discussion, we'll actually get into the specifics of what is involved in the Certified Data Privacy Solutions Engineer credential. But I'll just tease it right now so that you'll know what's coming after the panel. And that is, there are 3 domains of knowledge that are going to be covered by this credential. The domain of privacy governance, that is the highest level of internal control, policy, regulation, and fundamental concepts. Privacy architecture. As you're going to see in this certification and this credential from ISACA International, there is the term solutions engineer embedded in this certification. This is different than some of the other certifications that ISACA has put forth in the past, because from a technology perspective, it is specifically about designing and implementing and operating information systems that process, receive, transmit, store personally identifiable information. So there's an engineering aspect that is more technical and more focused than some of the previous managerial level certifications. This one starts at the highest level of governance and goes all the way down to different technology implementations and solutions. And then, of course, covered in the common body of knowledge for this certification is also concepts very appropriate and important to the data lifecycle of privacy information. We'll talk about specifics under each of those after the panel, but it's also important to know right now, and you may be interested in hearing this information, that there is currently an early adoption period open for this certification and some ways that you can actually adopt in and get into this certification right now that are accelerated because of the importance of this topic. That early adoption goes through March of 2021, and there's some additional information available at the link below. But again, don't worry, we'll cover some more information about this after we've had a chance for our panel to talk about it. So I hope you'll stick with us after the panel. The panel is going to be approximately an hour. That includes the discussion, the Q&A, and then the last 15 minutes after that, we'll spend diving into exactly this topic. But I know what you're really here for is the show, right? So let's get to it without further ado. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce the moderator of this panel, who is my colleague, as well as my personal friend, Julia Marina. She's the manager in our risk advisory services at Kaufman Ross, and that is the practice leader for our privacy engagements and our privacy implementations that have included a number of different types of engagements over the past couple of years that she can tell you about, and that she can share more information with you. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Julia Marina, who will be the moderator and who will take over for the panel section of this conversation. Without further delay, Julia.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Rob. That was very nice. I'd like to also thank everyone at ISACA for the opportunity to have this discussion today and for inviting us to speak. This is a very interesting topic for today, considering everything that is going on in the world right now. So with that, we'll go ahead and give you a little bit of a detail on our agenda for today. So we're going to go ahead and start talking about the impact of the pandemic on privacy. So to that end, we can definitely attest that we're experiencing unprecedented times. With this global spread of COVID-19, we've seen a migration from the office to remote working environments, and businesses have been forced to adopt new technologies and new practices for data collection, use, and disclosure to address this outbreak's effect on organizations. So for that, we're going to go ahead and discuss three major challenges that we've seen during this pandemic. With the first topic being the transition to remote work, we're going to be discussing some of our experiences. We have very experienced panelists today that will be talking about their transition to remote working environments within their organizations and their experience with it. So including the adoption of new technologies. Because part of managing through this crisis is not only addressing the crisis itself, but also ensuring that existing operations are able to continue as smoothly as possible, we're going to talk about how many organizations have had to quickly implement new technologies and tools to support this new environment. So to that end, I want to go ahead and just give you some quick background. The International Association of Privacy Professionals, along with Ernst & Young, launched a research initiative earlier this couple of months ago to gain more insight into the ways privacy and data protection practices have been affected by the pandemic. And let me share some quick, interesting findings with you. For full disclosure, a total of 933 respondents completed the survey, so it's still fresh data. But they did find that nearly half of the organizations, about 45%, have adopted a new technology or contracted with a new vendor to enable remote work due to the COVID-19. And of those organizations that have adopted new technologies, about 60% had accelerated or bypassed the traditional privacy or security review in order to keep business operations running. Another big major factor is that most employers are also now beginning to collect new data on their employees about personal travel, symptoms, and 60% of them are keeping records of employees diagnosed with COVID-19. Now, this is a lot of data. This gives us some insight into how organizations are responding to the changing needs of this new normal. So to that end, then we'll go ahead and transition over to the risks associated with doing business virtually. Well, with the rapid deployment of these new solutions and these new technologies, we're seeing that a lot of malicious actors are already attempting to exploit weaknesses due to the use of personal devices and insecure public and home networks. A recent survey from ISACA found that many companies are seeing an increase in the number of cyber attacks since the pandemic began. Also, the U.S. Federal Trade Commission recently reported that it has received nearly 30,000 fraud complaints related to COVID-19 since January, and that's amounting to some $20 million lost by consumers to these scams. So this is another big topic that we're seeing. So, and then finally, we'll go ahead and talk about considerations for bringing employees and customers back to offices as we begin to see some of these restrictions being lifted on social distancing. So with that, many businesses are facing data privacy questions regarding the collection and disclosure of personal information as they monitor the virus's impact. So we're going to start talking about how businesses have begun to reopen and the decisions that they have had to make concerning the when to reopen, the collection of data from employees and customers that they need to collect and monitor to keep everyone safe and to comply with local guidelines. And even sometimes when they operate in multiple jurisdictions, how some of these conflicting guidelines, how some of these guidelines conflict and how they have been able to overcome and deal with that. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our fabulous panel for today. First off, we have Winnie Ann Kunkel. She is a Director of Information Technology and Emerging Technologies at Florida International University's Herbert Wertheim College of Medicine. She has over 15 years of experience leading, implementing, managing, and delivering technology solutions. She leads the development and implementation of the IT infrastructure and the services, and along with her diverse team of IT professionals, she supports the academic, administrative, and clinical operations and initiatives at FIU. She also co-leads the development and implementation of the inaugural HIPAA security program and chairs the HIPAA committee for the Academic Health Center. Our next panelist is Luis Salazar. He's the founding partner of Salazar Law. He has been a lawyer for over 25 years. He is also a certified information privacy professional and inventor of the LawAgile legal project management method. Luis delivers fistfuls of wins for clients facing complex compliance, data privacy, litigation, bankruptcy, and cross-border challenges. Luis is also the drafter of the Privacy Policy Enforcement in Bankruptcy Act, which became law in 2005. Which regulates the sale of personal information by bankrupt companies and requires the Department of Justice to appoint a consumer privacy ombudsman to protect the privacy rights of consumers in bankruptcy cases. Luis has since been appointed by the Department of Justice as a consumer privacy ombudsman in over 25 matters. Luis also, fun fact, makes the best Cuban cafecito you have ever tasted. I'm sure, Luis, someone will take you up on that for due diligence purposes, of course.
Anytime.
And finally, our panelist, Lyndon Marcus. He is Senior Counsel for Privacy Compliance and Ethics at Hilton Grand Vacations. He's a Privacy Compliance and Ethics Attorney and Corporate Compliance Officer. He developed the GDPR and CCPA programs and Cybersecurity Incident Response Group for Hilton Grand Vacations. He also leads the CNE program focused on trade sanctions, anti-bribery, anti-money laundering. And prior to joining Hilton Grand Vacations, he worked in various compliance and privacy attorney positions with Avis Budget Group, Wyndham Worldwide, Burlington Stores, and Flexi Van Leasing. Fun fact, Lyndon is also a retired U.S. Air Force Lieutenant Colonel with over 4,800 flying hours and over 1,000 combat flying hours. Very impressive, Lyndon, and thank you for your service. And with that, I'd like to welcome the panel and welcome everyone. We'll go ahead and begin with our first poll question in order to begin our panel. And for our first poll question, we'd like to ask, do you read the privacy policy of all the new service providers you use prior to clicking the agree box? Let's see how many people can give us some insight into our current practices.
Are honest answers required?
Yes, honest answers are required.
It's anonymous.
We're not going to hold you to it.
We won't report this back to anybody. Don't worry.
And I believe the poll is open for a minute. Is that correct, Bob?
Yeah, I think about 60 seconds should give people more or less the amount of time to respond. We're actually getting a great response rate. We have so far 100 responses out of the 126 active participants, and it's still going up little by little, so we can see that people are continuing to respond. But since we want to keep this moving, we can go ahead and close it out with the 105 responses and share those results.
Wow. And as we can see, we have about a 69% rate of no and only a 31% rate of yes. I can say that I'm just as guilty sometimes in my personal use to just click that box because it's the easiest thing to get us going. But, you know, in our current environment, I think that that may not be the most advisable solution. And with that, we're going to talk about, you know, some of these transitions that we've had to make to go and change our workforce over to a remote working environment. I'll turn first to Winnie Ann to give us some insight. And, you know, my first question, you know, did you or in your current role in your organization have to make any changes in order to facilitate the remote working environment?
Hi, Julia. Thank you for that question. I appreciate the invitation to be here with all the panelists and attendees. I hope everyone is doing well. Happy Friday, everyone. So the answer is yes, absolutely. At the onset of going to remote, we quickly had to turn to telehealth to allow continuity of our health services. And with that, we ended up selecting Zoom telehealth platform to implement. We already had Zoom for the operations and the educational side, but the telehealth platform was new to us. And so this decision invariably brought about a number of changes that involved, you know, various key stakeholders across the organization, including the clinical system support team, HIPAA and IT security, compliance and privacy, counsel, and of course risk, to come together and collaborate on this effort with very little runway. So I'm sure this, everyone has had this experience or shared this experience given this very quick remote environment that we've had to adapt to. And so specifically as far as changes, what followed were a lot of discussions, you know, on what we can do to do what we want to do from a HIPAA compliance perspective, privacy, legal, and risk. And so once, you know, we vetted this from, you know, understanding what our safeguards and showstoppers were, and were able to move forward, then several things happened in parallel that, of course, required changes, required development of forms, required development of processes and procedures. And so, yes, a lot of changes happened, I want to say, in the ensuing month and a half following our very quick turn to a remote situation.
And did you experience any expected or unexpected issues with the transition? I know that, you know, when we are going from, even though we have the best of intentions with, you know, BCP plans or anything like that, sometimes, you know, the unexpected does happen. Or, you know, did you feel that there was anything that came up that you hadn't foreseen before?
I want to say that the unexpected were really around, processes that we perhaps did not recognize or identify, you know, in the beginning. But because of this change, as we know, with the implementation of any technology, there's a whole lot of things that have to happen in order for that to be successful. So the unexpected is really around uncovering processes that needed to be developed, trained, and implemented. So it wasn't until we, you know, we actually implemented this solution following, you know, some developments of consent forms, guidelines, et cetera, training material, and going through, you know, a pilot or dry run, did we uncover some other logistical, you know, measures that needed to be accounted for. But really nothing that we did not overcome in this particular, you know, scenario.
And like the IAPP survey found, a lot of companies had, you know, to move quickly and may have either, you know, bypassed or reduced the due diligence that they do on, you know, vendors and the onboarding of new technologies. You know, did you feel that you needed to do the same? Did you have sufficient time? Did you feel that you had enough in place to be able to transition quickly?
So it's funny, that question, because in the beginning it was, you know, once we got the directive that we needed to have continuity of service, right? And Zoom telehealth would be our platform. You kind of, at least in my observation, you you had different camps that represented their areas of expertise. And so there were we got to get this going. We have to get this implemented like next week or yesterday, right? And then you had other folks that, of course, you know, either in the privacy or security, and in part, I have some HIPAA security oversight for the med school as well. So I totally understand that. You know, you have we need to get this done, the operations part of it, and then there are the components of, well, you know, this needs to be secure, this needs to be compliant, and et cetera. There were a lot of discussions that had to be discussed around, you know, can we do this? What are some concessions in the rules right now? And so we talked about the relaxed OCR enforcement, and we had to have privacy, HIPAA privacy, compliance and privacy on the table, as well as counsel, to be able to help define that and clarify that no, you know, there is, you know, that HIPAA security rule is it's not that it doesn't apply, right? It's we needed clarifications around what it meant that OCR relaxed the rules, and it really was not that the rules were relaxed. It was the enforcement that was relaxed. So there was a lot of discussions around that, so that each key stakeholders understood exactly what that meant, and eventually we came together. And once we got clarity around that, we're able to be effective in doing what we do best in each of our respective expert roles and move forward. So a lot of discussions and clarifications around what it meant on this due to COVID.
Absolutely, and I'm glad that you mentioned the collaboration across departments, because you're in a very large organization, and sometimes when we have smaller organizations, it's very difficult to go ahead and get everyone at the table. Quick question: does your organization have a dedicated privacy officer and did you reach out to them?
Yes, fortunately we do, and yes, we absolutely did, and we're fortunate that we actually have, I think, all the right required positions in place that I've mentioned. The compliance and privacy, the legal counsel, the risk director of risk, clinical systems. All of these components were so crucial, and of course the CISO. Right, all of these components were so crucial to being at the table, to discussing what we can do to help facilitate this, and everybody was really, in my observation, a true measure of collaboration, and everyone being on the same, operating on the same goal to implement this solution so that we could have continuity of health services, but doing it in the right way. So going back to your question, did we compromise anything? We did it actually. In the very short runway that we did, we managed to get policies and guidelines implemented. All of these areas had representation in this. So, I want to say that because in part the relaxed enforcement still requires some good faith provisions, and so we were very mindful of that. So we really did our best to make sure that this was still a very solid solution for the university.
Thank you. And that's very true. And with that, I want to go ahead and ask our second poll question about our privacy officer. So now we're going to go ahead and launch that particular question. And we want to find out, does your organization have a designated privacy officer? I know that since privacy is an up and coming, topic for a lot of organizations, they may not be so familiar with them if they're not coming from a, traditionally regulated industry. So we want to see, in the last, 12 months, 18 months, has there been a transition? Do you work at an organization that has a privacy officer?
And so far we have 88 respondents, 89 respondents out of the 129 active participants in the poll, and the numbers are still going up, and we've been at 45 seconds. We're still we're above 100 respondents. So we have that prior benchmark of approximately just over 100 respondents that we're able. And just so you know, you may need to disable block-ups, or I'm sorry, pop-ups. You may need to enable pop-ups to be able to respond to the poll if you're watching this in a browser. But it's been 60 seconds, and I'll go ahead and end that now, Julia, with the 105 respondents, and share that with everyone now.
Oh, wow. So there's about 60% that do have privacy officers and about 40% that do not have designated privacy officers yet. Notice how I say yet, because things are changing. And I think this is a good segue since Winnie Ann was talking about some of the potential, luckily she has not had to see the potential compromises, but when she was talking about some of this relaxed enforcement and some of these privacy risks, I'm going to go ahead and turn over to Luis next to talk about some of the risks of doing business virtually, particularly with the new privacy regulations, everything that's coming out and that has been rolling out. If we're doing business across borders, you may be familiar with GDPR in the EU. Here in the United States, we have the sectoral regulations. If you're in a regulated industry, you have HIPAA, FERPA in education, GLBA for financial institutions. And now, luckily, with CCPA in California, we're going to have regulation across industries, no longer sector-based, but potentially across the board. And with that, we're going to go ahead and, Luis, if you can give us some background, what are some of the privacy risks we should keep in mind when we're doing business virtually now, that we're fully online, that we're at different locations? What should businesses be looking for?
Julia, thank you so much. Roberto, thank you. And ISACA, thank you for having me. I'm very flattered to be on this panel with my fellow panelists. I think when you're looking at, to answer that question, you start with kind of where we were, what we've gone through, and what that new normal might look like. So we know that before the crisis, there was a groundswell of privacy and cybersecurity regulations, starting, as you noted, with GDPR and then the CCPA. And we know immediately before the crisis and the lockdown, the CRPA, the new groundswell coming out of California, which is going to set new benchmarks and presumably even establish an enforcement agency. That appears to be on the ballot for November, although it's presently in court. So we had a very strong groundswell of kind of standard setting that applied in a very national way, with some 12 states looking at their own privacy laws, and even the group that produces uniform laws, state laws, looking to create a uniform privacy law. So that was before, and then we went into the remote work situation and the lockdown, like the middle of our crisis, our disaster, as it were. And the kind of things we saw there, what you mentioned from the survey, is rapid adoption of software and technology without the usual vetting, without the usual testing, without the retention policies and the security that would normally be implemented with those controls. And then you had, I think, that from a company level, but from an individual level, many people using unauthorized technology, cloud technology, unauthorized hardware, doing work on hardware that's not authorized, and doing things that are not authorized on hardware that is authorized. And all of those things, including using inappropriate or unapproved means of chat and social media to communicate. So all of those create risks where the data may get out in the wild, where there is a lack of retention, the lack of retention in case of litigation, in case of problems or evidence needed of adequate steps being taken for security and data privacy purposes. And all that is taking place, and as Winnie Ann noted, in an environment where it kind of appeared that, let's get productive here, let's try and make it all happen, and we'll worry about some of these other issues later. But the messaging from most agencies and enforcers was, we really are going to hold you to our standards. The CCPA, the Attorney General, was explicitly asked to delay enforcement, and their response was basically, hey, you've had plenty of time to do this. We're not stopping the regulation. So I think we're coming out of this environment now into the post-disaster timeframe and looking at where's that enforcement going to land? Where are those rules and the dangers that we've gone through? How are they going to be exposed, and maybe who's going to be made an example of?
And to that, if you can speak a bit about the CCPA and some of the teeth that regulation is going to have. We do know that that's going to be rolling out now in July.
Well, and to some extent already, those who it applies to should already be in compliance, right? But here's the thing: it's not only CCPA and the potential fines there, GDPR and the potential fines there, and at every level, the amount of fines that you can suffer. But the worst things that really come out of that, a violation of that kind, is what people may not know or may not experience is the decade or more of government regulation, overview, and reporting that's required from your company if you're one of those individuals, one of those companies that suffers a breach, right? That suffers some regulatory violation. The government will look at you closely for a very long length of time. And I had a client that suffered exactly that issue, and the moment they had another misstep later, they were immediately subject to enforcement action all over again. That's one thing. And I think what we're really seeing that we can't avoid is that the reputational risk is even worse than the fines. If you're the one that the finger gets pointed to, like who wants to be the subject of a public scourging on Twitter or Instagram or in the media, and be the topic of discussion even for a minute. And we could see that in many examples during the quarantine and before, when the focus of the media and public kind of condemnation is on a company for inappropriate action, it's devastating. So that is potentially worse than any of the fines or the punishment that you might get from violating one of many regulations.
Absolutely. And with that, when you see the nexus between privacy and security, I think that's where the biggest risk lies. Right now, a lot of these privacy regulations have a lot of reference a lot of security requirements. So for example, if it requires specific encryption or specific security measures in order to protect the institution, we have to take a look at that from a privacy perspective as well. It's not sufficient to just have a robust security program in place, but you also need to make sure that your security program takes into account privacy. And where this comes together is in the data breach space. So can you tell us a little bit about, I know we all know data breaches, but specifically, what is exactly is considered a data breach for those of us that may not know?
Well, it's a good question. There's about 50 to 100 different variations of an answer to that question, depending on where you might be, where you're getting the information from, and the like. But most broadly, what you're looking for is a breach in the security of the system that leads to unauthorized access of computerized data that contains personally identifiable information. And what that can be, where we at the most basic is name, address, email, date of birth, social security, those kind of hot button issues. But we also now have biometric information, IP addresses, and or in some cases broadly defined, any information that could lead to potentially identifying an individual, right? So it gives you a big basket of information that potentially can trigger an analysis of whether a data breach has occurred. The second issue to look at then is kind of the risk analysis that some statutes allow you to undertake. Even if you have that kind of a breach, do you have to report it? Is there actually a risk? Is there some good faith basis to say that no one's going to be harmed by this access? It was inadvertent. There's no bad faith involved. You might have a situation where an employee inadvertently sees some level of information they're not entitled to, and that may not trigger a breach, for example. So in a nutshell, those are the kind of the parameters of a data breach. So you could see where if there's unauthorized access, breach of the security of a system is potentially the baseline. All the remote working we're doing, all the unprotected channel transmission of data, and the pocketing of data in other devices that may not be authorized, or in cloud services that may not be authorized, and the like, could potentially lead to data breach and related type of violations.
And along with the data breaches, there's also the notification requirements. So each of these, depending on where you do business, whether it's, the different 50 states or different countries, each of these privacy regulations may have different data breach reporting and notification to different regulators. What would be your recommendation for businesses that are doing business across multiple jurisdictions? What would you say to that? How would you practically implement that in a privacy program?
Well, I think if you're looking to have a baseline of compliance, then the analysis has to be on what jurisdiction do you conduct business in, and then you can actually kind of devise a kind of minimum requirements, best practices as a result of the different laws that may apply. Look, I'd say to protect yourself in a general sense, if you're if members here are facing this kind of, we're coming out of a crisis situation, it's a new normal. We don't know what that new normal is going to be. Like, how do you protect yourself? Because you do have employees, you can't go into everyone's house. Obviously, practically, nor would you want to. But what do you want to do? You want to show that you have due diligence, right? If you didn't have policies, effective policies when this happened, now is a good time to look at those work from home policies, to look at your information security policies, your Zoom meeting policies, whatever it is. See where it needs to be updated and the procedures updated, and show evidence. You're able to show evidence that, look, we looked at this, we're acting in good faith, we're doing our due diligence, we're looking at our systems. Regulators look at that to see, like, did you just let anything go, or you tried your best and you've been diligent about protecting those assets? And I think the second thing you'd want to do is, at a minimum, is reinvigorate, reemphasize cybersecurity. There's really no understating how great it is and how effective it is to do frontline training with your employees. Even if they're using all these crazy devices, if you can train them effectively, like not to click on that email, that one thing, think how effective that is. And studies show that even a little bit of training, even a 10-minute blurb here and there, reinforces those good practices. And so it's beneficial in that sense to take that plunge under a difficult environment when people's minds were on different things. Let's get them back to that basic training, record and keep evidence of the fact that you're doing that, because that also is going to help you mitigate and deal with regulators and the like, should you have an uncomfortable situation of a breach or the like.
Absolutely, and I agree. Document, evidence, training, top things to be looking at right now as we start to adopt this new remote working environment. And I agree. And with that, we're going to go ahead and ask our third poll question to our audience, because we want to see, what are they doing now and how are they going forward? And our next poll question is, what are your organization's plans for reopening? We want to see where we stand now and what we're going to look at in the future as we start to reopen.
This certainly will be an interesting response to get from the audience, won't it?
Absolutely.
And I guess the idea is that by reopening is physically back in the office, right? Because I'd say, I never really closed, but certainly my office physically was closed. Yeah.
Yes.
Good point.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So it's been 40 seconds, and so far we have 94 of the now 132 participants who have responded, and that number is continuing to go up. So we'll continue to allow just a few more moments as people are responding, whether they never physically closed, whether they reopened already in May, reopened already in June, or are reopening in June, will in July, near it, end of year or beyond, or no date determined yet. And so at this point, it's been just beyond a minute, and I'll go ahead and end the poll and share the results.
Oh, wow. This is very interesting. So 34% have never closed, so they're still on site. Incredible. Also, let's see. Now we're starting to see a trend now reopening back in June, about 23%, and then July, and so forth. Very interesting results, because this is one of the biggest challenges that we're going to be seeing now as we start reopening and bringing people back on site, employees, clients, customers. There are many considerations that we have to take into account in order to bring them back safely, and of course comply with any particular guidelines in our different jurisdictions. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn over to Lyndon to talk a little bit about transitioning back into the office environment, bringing employees back. There's many issues with that, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges that businesses are seeing right now. How do we do this? How do we do this safely? How do we minimize risk and potential liability going forward? And Lyndon, I know you work for a very large organization, so I'm going to ask you, what has been your biggest challenge with bringing the employees back on site?
Thanks, Julia, and thanks for that question, and thanks, Rob and the ISACA team for having me as part of this panel. There's a lot. This is definitely a subject that a lot of us are interested in, especially as we want to get our business going back as quickly as possible. like many companies, we operate in a number of locations, in a number of jurisdictions, various states, as well as in other countries. So it poses a lot of issues as far as trying to standardize things the best you can, and understanding that as you standardize things, you don't want to miss the fact that the various jurisdictions have different limitations or restrictions about opening up businesses. And in our business in particular, we run a number of resorts in various states as well as in various countries. And we also have our corporate locations and our call center locations. So really trying to put it all together and trying to develop the proper standards, standardization for our procedures and policies, processes, that has been kind of the big challenge. We're trying to meet the various requirements, but trying to standardize these procedures and processes to the extent possible. That way we could hopefully maintain better control of what goes on in the workplace, as well as ensuring better protection for our team members, our employees, our customers, our guests, and our business partners. But really, that has been the challenge, is trying to, how do you comply with the various restrictions in different areas. That has been the challenge. In our resort properties, for example, we're just now in the process of opening up in a few of the jurisdictions. In particular, we're getting started to open up in Nevada. We've recently opened in Florida and in South Carolina, and various requirements at those locations. So whether it's Vegas or whether it's Orlando, Florida, we have to make sure that at those resorts we are really meeting the local requirements, the state requirements. And what we've really tended to do is kind of taken the broader view and say, okay, what are the most restrictive at this point? And does it make sense to apply this across the board? And that really is how we've addressed it so far. Again, we've only started opening our resort locations in a few jurisdictions in a few states, but as this goes on, we have to keep an eye on what's going on in each state, because each state is phasing in slowly and removing restrictions, limitations at varying speeds, and some states are going to be more restrictive than others, and we have to really kind of navigate through that to ensure that we are meeting what the requirements are, and also looking ahead, because we don't want to continuously change this, how we standardize the various processes and procedures. So we're trying to put this all together. We've really handled it on really a cross-functional way, as you can imagine, similar to what Winnie was mentioning earlier. We bring our various experts, from whether it's resort ops or our sales team, our facilities team, as well as the various corporate functions. We've come together. We've been working on this really from day one, from the time we started closing our resorts down, and from the time we sent our corporate employees to work remotely. We've really started working on, okay, what are we going to do next? When are we going to be able to bring our people back and back into the workplace to start working from our offices and from the resorts rather than remotely? So really, it has been a challenge just trying to standardize to the extent we can. And we've really taken the conservative view of trying to take the more restrictive restrictions and limitations and applying that as our standard moving forward. And that'll change just as CDC guidance will change, and the various public health officials will change the guidance they give to their states. We're going to have to be able to be nimble and be able to kind of take that all in and apply it appropriately.
And that's absolutely true. And I was about to ask you about that, because sometimes with some particular regulations, we always like to be more conservative and take, a minimum, at least a minimum standard approach to the regulation to ensure that at least we meet the minimum across of the organization. But with that, what are some considerations that we should be looking at when we're modifying our privacy policies or compliance programs as a result of this pandemic? Because there's multiple things that we have to work with. We have to work with information sharing, information retention, data collection and use. So what are some things that we should be keeping in mind, and what programs should we be modifying as a response?
Yeah, I think when we're modifying the privacy policies or various procedures across the board, across the company, we really have to be mindful that we're focusing right now. Our crisis right now is COVID-19, and we have to look at maybe looking beyond that, and not specifically COVID-19, but maybe health, kind of standardize it for health emergencies or health crises, and for various other things, maybe social disturbances, various things like that. And I think really we have to keep that in mind, that when we're looking 2 years down the road, it may not be COVID-19. Hopefully it's not COVID-19 still. It could be another epidemic or pandemic, or it could be some other social unrest going on, or some other crisis. And so as we go through this, we have to be mindful of the fact that as we modify and update our policies, that we do it in a way that, okay, this makes sense for the long term while still addressing the immediate crisis at hand. And I think that's really kind of an important thing for us to keep in mind. We also have the issue, you guys have all mentioned it already, we had GDPR, we've had CCPA, and then the various other laws and regulations that will be coming out over the next few years as privacy and information security really, people are really starting to understand the importance of this. And we have to make sure that as we modify and update our policies, that we keep in mind that, okay, there's going to be more to come, and we have to look at how are we going to address that? How are we going to address, if Maine all of a sudden comes up with a CCPA or possibly a more strict regulations and limitations than CCPA has, and how are we going to do that? So I think we really have to keep that in mind in terms of having the long view on this, and not just concentrating specifically on COVID-19. Addressing issues as to who we should share information with, when and why, that's important. That's something we've been conditioned to look at, especially with GDPR and CCPA. Make sure that when we're collecting information, there's a reason for us to collect that information, and we know why we're doing it, what we're going to do with it, and really have an idea of what is the time frame of us really using that information. And then, of course, making sure that we are transparent, and we are providing appropriate notice for those types of information. So those are the types of things we really need to make sure we have at top of mind as we continue to modify our privacy policies. Absolutely.
Document, document, document.
Yes.
And with a very particular issue specific to a health crisis as we're seeing now, let's talk about employee screening issues. I mean, that's a hot topic right now with bringing employees back. Can you give us a little bit of an idea of what any employee screening issues that you've had to come across or consider, with how to do it, who to do it with, how to retain this information, notice requirements for employees, anything about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And that really is a big issue. That's something we've wrestled with, and we've tried to look and see what what other companies are doing, and also, what makes sense. And really it'll depend, a lot of it will depend on the industry you're in, how the regulations around your particular industry, and also the environment of your workplace, and also the environment of your customer-facing operations. So that all has to be taken into account. Really, the goal at the end of the day is we want to provide a safe environment for our employees, our customers, business partners, and be able to provide them with the confidence that they could come to our location, they could interact with our business safely, and that we are doing everything we can to ensure their safety. So that being our goal, we have to start then looking at, to your question specifically, Julia, what level of testing and screening do we really want? Are we going to require people to take a COVID-19 test or antibody testing in order to come back to the workplace? Are we going to require taking temperature of each individual when they initially come to the workplace, or even every day, or what is the how often are we going to take these tests? I think what I've found, and I think the kind of direction we're going is to go the way of a self-assessment. And what we're doing is, we're asking our employees to conduct a self-assessment daily. Don't show up to work unless you have, gone through the self-assessment and you've essentially answered no to these questions. The questions being around the idea of, have you been exposed to somebody who's been diagnosed with or tested positive for COVID-19? Have you been exposed to somebody who is feeling ill and potentially may have COVID-19? Have you tested positive for COVID-19? Are you feeling sick? Those types of things. So we are going the direction of a self-assessment for our employees to conduct every day before they come to work. And as far as temperature taking, that's part of the questionnaire. When we ask for, do you have symptoms of COVID-19? Things like, your temperature, 100.4 or higher, things like that. So that, I think, is probably a good middle of the road way of doing it, is rather than trying to tell people that they need to show us a clean COVID-19 test, or specifically taking the temperature of each employee as they come to the workplace. We've gone with the self-assessment, and we have our employees really acknowledge the fact that this is a required thing they have to do every day. It does pose problems or questions with regards to they take the self-assessment. They find that they do have symptoms, or they were exposed, let's say, the night before they had dinner with somebody who apparently tested positive for COVID-19 recently. They're supposed to contact their supervisor, and then now once the supervisor has this information, what does she do with it, and how do we secure that information? And that's the other side of it. That is where we have to be able to secure that information separate from the personnel file. It has to be handled as confidential information and stored separately from the personnel file with limited access to only those who have the need to access that information. So that is really kind of the direction we're going with that. And just one thing, I know that there was a question that did come in a few minutes ago about COVID-19 testing, and if we collect that information, or if we have that information from an employee, what do we do with it, and how long do we store it? At what point do we get rid of it? Great question. If you have that information, again, you have to treat it as confidential information and store it separately from their personnel files and limit the access to it. In terms of how long you keep it, again, that is a question as far as if a vaccine does come around, and are you going to require your employees to get the vaccine? At which point it takes away potentially the necessity of maintaining the documentation or information you have about a person's COVID-19 positive test. I think you've got to look at it as an organization and see do we still need this? And is there a reason for us to have it? If your answer as an organization is we don't need it because all our employees are going to be getting the vaccination, so we're not going to require this, we're not going to need it. At that point, the answer is you probably should destroy that or get rid of that information. Again, it'll depend on the organization and how you go about what you would use the information for, and is it in line with the purpose that you had told your employees that you had collected that information for.
And with that, I'd like to also open it up to Luis, if you have any comments on that, on the retention of this new information that we're collecting.
Well, I think there's a number of different things you want to look at. There are explicit restrictions if you are governed in any way by the GDPR. There's also biometric information privacy acts in different states, notably Illinois, and with very powerful provisions. Illinois has been a hotbed of biometric lawsuits, class action lawsuits, and they've really focused a lot on that, on the employee information intake for employees. I think to some extent it is novel, or maybe more notable, that employers are obtaining this information. But around infectious diseases, there's a lot of public information about personal conditions, right? Contact tracing is something that public health agencies do. Hospitals report that. So to some extent, it's hard. It is a public type information with maybe some less stringent privacy controls. But I think where employers are concerned, they still have to treat it as kind of a hot personal information that should not be shared with anybody. Lyndon, I'd say that there's sunset provisions even that we can discard information even sooner. There's certainly anonymization techniques that can be used to protect the data where it's resting. And I think we have to actually consider the idea that, well, many people are going to refuse to take the vaccine. And so that's not going to be a solution. And then even after we take the vaccine, there's coronaviruses, other coronaviruses that are could equally be as lethal, or other viruses. So some infectious disease policy or procedure may be appropriate on an ongoing basis. And look, let's face it,
right.
I'm an attorney, so my business is about hours and being present. I mean, how many times have I gone in when I've been sick? And Julia, I think everybody here might say the same thing, right? Like, wow, no, am I really that sick? People are gonna think I'm not trying to go to work. But we were infecting people with maybe milder diseases, some people who should not have been infected. So there's perhaps a level of this is with the right restrictions on privacy, maybe this is a good screening mechanism that people should continue to use, even if everything goes great and coronavirus, COVID-19 disappear.
Absolutely. And with that, I want to go ahead and open up to any other questions from the audience. We have a few more minutes left before we go ahead and make some closing remarks. So if anyone has any questions, Rob, if you see any available questions, please feel free.
Thank you, Julia. We've seen a couple come in, and maybe what I'll do is I'll go ahead and pass the questions to you, Julia, for you to disperse to the panel so that you can handle those as you see fit. So there's a question that came in: would the panel recommend having a broad privacy approach, regardless if the jurisdiction requires it? For example, even if it's beyond CCPA for California customers, or focus only on the area as it requires it, or just take one sort of universal approach across. And maybe Julia, you can kind of help some of our panelists respond to that.
No, I think that, it's open to the panel and anyone that would like to jump in. Absolutely.
I'd love to. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I do as a consumer privacy ombudsman is try to determine the value of data. And what I've noticed over time, where in the beginning there was an approach, an idea that less restrictions on data, more of the Wild West approach, that made it that created value. But now buyers of data are switched completely to the opposite side, where they want to make sure that your data intake is correct, that you've got consumer buy-in, and agreement, consent, and that increases the value of the data. So what I would say to you is that the idea of an approach, again, subject to the practicalities of the financing it and being able to afford it, but the idea of an approach that says, what's the least I can do is ultimately diminishing to the value of the company and to the values for all the different stakeholders, shareholders. And if you have a smaller company that maybe, you know, their owner is someone you see walking down the hallway, you know, they're looking to exit that company perhaps and retire, then, you know, they want to make sure the value is there. So cutting corners in that way, I think, is self-defeating. So I'd say try and get the broadest, best practice approach to data. I want to get you encompassing as much compliance as possible, because ultimately that's really going to go to your bottom line.
Absolutely, and how Lyndon was mentioning, you want to make sure that you future-proof whatever implementations you do now. You know, when you update your privacy policies, programs, notices, any other procedures, you want to make sure that you look at it with a future perspective in mind, because you don't want to have to keep updating these things as we go along.
Yeah.
Great point. Another question that's coming in, can you share your thoughts on firms that have announced they will only open 50% and allow only 50% of employees to return? Thoughts on how, who, which employees from a privacy point of view? What are the privacy implications on kind of picking certain groups and not picking other groups of employees to come in? Maybe Lyndon, maybe you can get us started on that. I know you're dealing with a lot of employees across a very broad type of spectrum. So what are some thoughts on that, segmenting the population?
Yeah, I think segmenting probably makes sense, just in the sense that you know, you've got to do what your business needs in order to succeed. So you bring on the employees that you need to conduct the operations as the operations start opening up slowly. The one thing to always remember, though, even as you know, we don't want it to be a completely business-centric decision, because there are we want to make sure that if we had furloughed, for example, or we had kept certain employees working from home, that probably should be brought to the workplace early to ensure whether it's you know, IT and information security or your legal team or privacy team, that you bring those, you know, those individuals in the workplace if you really need to ensure that you know, those issues are and the issues that they would deal with are going to be given the proper attention as needed. But having said that, to be honest, if you're working remotely, which in most corporate functions you can work remotely, I think whether, you know, we've shown that we can be very effective working remotely, and so whether you are working remotely or coming into the office, you know, it may not make that much of a difference. Probably the biggest difference is if you had furloughed employees and you're thinking which ones are we going to bring back on. That's where, you know, you really have to look at it strategically to make sure that there are you know, you are having the right mix of employees to not only conduct the business but to conduct it in probably the safest way possible.
Yeah.
And I'd like to ask that same question to Winnie Ann, if you want to, you know, give your comments on that. I know you're also in a big organization that is, you know, having to consider either bringing everyone back on site or some form of hybrid. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So we are obviously a university. We have students as well. The decision is still out in terms of what the plans are going to be in the fall. But of course, a lot of discussions around, you know, the different models that we would have if we were to do a hybrid situation, right? The segmentation. What is the impact? You know, what does it look like for the students? What does it look like for the workforce? And a lot of discussions are being had around this hybrid situation. And so, and personally, I think, you know, and, you know, as I oversee the IT department, my personal view around that is be practical and be flexible. So if you have the ability to work from home, if you need to come in, you know, come in. Practicing, of course, the physical distancing, CDC guidelines, et cetera, or what organizational policy procedure around that. But I think it's, you know, these are unique times, right? And I think we're having to think outside of the box, outside of the normal convention. In the end, I kind of check, I do sort of a gut check. Does this make sense? You know, does this allow us to continue to support the operations of the organization while keeping, you know, your valued workforce members, your employees and your staff safe? So, you know, I think as we're going through this, you know, I think it's really important that be flexible and be practical, you know.
May I say something on that, Julia?
Yes, of course, please.
Yeah, I think this topic is much more radioactive than it lends itself. And you immediately think, because there's operational issues, but let's think about who you're calling back, who is on the front lines, and in our context today, look what we're seeing in the papers and on TV right now. The racial disparity of how businesses approach, you know, the application of their policies, right? That's a very hot button issue and very appropriately true. So who's being called back and who's being, you know, most exposed during that time? That's something to consider. Who's that half that's going to come back? And then apply to that as well. You know, what if you have employees that say, well, you know, I have respiratory conditions, you know, I have, or I have 50 other requirements that are maybe uniquely mine, biometrically uniquely mine, or racially or ethnically, or you name it. So all these factors are, you know, even though you might say like, what can I just isolate it and say, I don't really even have to worry about the data because I'm just talking about what's the economics, how do I run my business? But you're making choices so that some people stay home, some people come, some people get exposed, some people don't. So I think that there's, you know, there's a real compliance risk there that, you know, that relies on private data to ultimately make decisions that people could get, you know, a lot of complaints about and a lot of litigation around.
Absolutely, I agree.
Yeah. Fair point.
And then there's a couple of other questions that have come in as well. So right now we're collecting, because of the distributed workforce, we're collecting a lot of information from people's personal homes, their personal networks, their personal devices. We're collecting a lot of this type of information and logging it and maybe even doing analytics on it for behavioral and security purposes, that sort of thing. So there can be a sort of personal information and privacy impact there. What are some suggestions for how to consider, understand the risk of gathering that type of personal information, and then also properly handling that throughout the life cycle, whatever that's determined to be, for that type of remote worker information? Maybe Winnie Ann, maybe since that's got a little bit of a technical aspect, you can get us started on that and we can see what your thoughts are there.
Roberto, can you repeat the last thing you mentioned? I had you on.
Yeah, no problem. So basically, to boil it down, we're gathering a lot of information about people's personal behavior at home and their personal devices, and maybe even their personal networks as part of our security monitoring, and even maybe some additional requirements that we're pushing out on things that they install on their personal devices in that sort of scenario. What are some of the risks associated with that, and maybe policies and controls in response to managing that type of personal information, which is a little bit less obvious than some of the more you know, prominent personal information?
Yeah. So I think what helps is having an institutional, is a central policy guideline around, you know, what equipment to use, what are the technical requirements that take into account IT security requirements that your workforce should use, because we did find ourselves, you know, in having everybody work from home. Not everybody necessarily had a laptop, right? You have, you know, some have desktops, some have laptops, some have both. And so you find that you're in a position where, you know, a lot are having to use their personal computers. So there were discussions around that, but I think that is I think it helps to have a solid, you know, security policy around computing and networking, and to defer back to your organizational policy procedure around that, and then handle situations on a case-by-case basis that are not in alignment with that. And again, it helps to reinforce and have to have these discussions in your circles. And so various communications really needed to be had as we switch from, you know, what, you know, was sort of a tried and true local, you know, working environment to now, sort of in this transition, I think there was some confusion as to, well, what now? Like, do the same policies apply? Are there new policies? And I think you find that people are having to be innovative in their own way so that they could continue to work. And if that meant, they were using their personal stuff and storing them, I think it helps to have an organization or department-wide communication as to, hey, this is where we're at now. Please be reminded that this still applies, and if you're not so it's having to reinforce that there is an existing infrastructure around policies, procedures that exist with that. And in terms of providing guidance, yes, there were communication to our end users as to some best practices, right? I mean, we talk about Zoom bombing, here's what you can do to prevent Zoom bombing from occurring. If you're going to be even down to your internet, if you're having internet connections, stay close to your router. So we're having to have these this ongoing sort of daily discussion with our workforce members and even our students to talk about best practices to continue to be able to work from home, but also not save things. Again, a reminder, only store information in its authorized locations. That still exists, even though, sort of our work landscape has changed. You still have to store PHI and the approved information, clinical information systems, and everything has to be encrypted. So we have that solid foundation where, you have to use organization issued computers that are encrypted, that are updated, that are managed basically in a centralized manner. So again, I think it's reminding the workforce members that, we still have to follow this and then handle things on a case-by-case basis.
Absolutely. Thank you, Winnie Ann. And actually, thank all of you. You've been extremely gracious with your time. There's still a lot of questions coming in, but you've answered the most pressing ones for us, and I can tell that this is a topic that will continue to need to be revisited very much in the future. So we'll certainly make your contact information available to the extent that makes sense and is okay with you for ongoing discussion. Otherwise, thanks very much for sharing your time with us, for sharing your expertise. We're extremely grateful to you for sharing these insights with us and sharing this Friday morning now become afternoon with us as well. And you're all more than welcome to stay to hear us discuss just a couple of quick facts about the ISACA certification, but we know that you have very pressing time commitments as well. So thank you very much for doing this panel with us. Happy Friday. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care.
And for those of us who are still on this session, we're now going to talk about the other topic that we wanted to get into. And, if you'll forgive me, I let that panel go on just a little bit long because there were just so many really good questions coming in. So I'm going to go through this quickly, but that is the Certified Data Privacy Solutions Engineer. So I'll be efficient in my time with covering this topic, but it's a very important topic and a topic that a lot of our members and the public and our community are very interested in right now, and that is how to express, credentialize, communicate your expertise in this domain, specifically among your colleagues, among your peers, among employers, setting a career track, demonstrating the things that you know, and why this credential specifically from ISACA International may be a good fit for you. First of all, one of the questions that may come to mind for you is that there are some extremely good privacy credentials out there in the marketplace already. Why is ISACA presenting this offering to the marketplace? Why the CDPSE? And the reason that ISACA has done this, as can be answered in their FAQs question about this topic, but as I'll also explain to you right now, is that this is a specifically technology-focused credential around privacy governance, security, and risk management, right? So this is specifically with a technology implementation, design, and operation focus in mind. So as a result of that, you're going to see the domains of knowledge that are covered in this credential are covering exactly that, the design and implementation of an information system that is compliant and that is secure for protecting personally identifiable and other privacy-related information. So that's what differentiates this credential from other very good credentials out there in the marketplace, and that it enables the professionals who will hold this credential to be able to work across the other domains of professions that they're going to find in their environment, which includes things like legal counsel and compliance departments, which include things like policy orchestration and governance, risk, and compliance departments, which includes things like the technical professionals in your organization, such as database administrators, software engineers, software developers, back-end, front-end types of professionals. So for that reason, this credential is different. And this credential has right now, as I mentioned before, an accelerated timeline for early adoption. And that is, there are a few things, as a matter of fact, there's 3 things that you can do right now to establish and gain this certification. And that is, first of all, you have to make sure that you have the experience requirement. They're requiring 5 years of work experience in at least 2 of the 3 domains, which I'm going to cover in the next slide. But 2 of those 3 domains have to be demonstrated in at least 5 of your years of work experience. In addition to that, once you have demonstrated that, then you need to go ahead and fill out the application. You need to pay the fee. You can see that the fee for members and non-members is there on the slide. I know some people are joining by phone, so $695 for members, $880 for non-members is the application fee. By the way, if you do not meet the requirements right now and you submit your application during this early adoption process, that entire fee minus a $50 processing is returned to you. So if this is something that you're interested in, we'll cover those domains in just a second. It's definitely worth pursuing. Furthermore, a number of the people on this call and a number of the people in the community interested in exactly this topic already hold certain certifications, right? We talked about specifically other privacy certifications. One is mentioned down there, the Fellow of Information Privacy from the IAPP is one of the other certifications that's being considered in this to reduce the requirement from 5 years to 3 years. If you hold that and these other certifications, and these other certifications are ISACA certifications, the CISA, the CISM, the CGUITE, the CRISC, or CSXP, if you hold any of these others, you're reducing from 5 years to 3 years. And now we're going to go ahead and hop in to say, okay, what are those domain and experience requirements? What are 2 of the 3? I see them there: governance, architecture, lifecycle, and the amount that makes up each of these areas. But specifically, what do you mean by these? Let's get into a little bit more of the granularity in these final couple of moments that we have on this call. So privacy governance, right? So governance, the highest level of internal control, that strategic level of internal control, sometimes at the board, sometimes at the steering committee, sometimes at some strategic body within an organization, setting the policies that govern the entire organization, defining what that means, determining data subject rights, mapping themselves against a governance framework for the legal requirements, those kinds of things. That's covered under governance. Then moving down through the implementation of internal control, the management team, the roles and responsibility related to that data, privacy training and awareness, third-party risk management and data sharing. You heard that topic mentioned on our panel today. Data sharing, how that process should be managed, auditing of the private information that is in your environment, validating the security and controls around it, and then of course managing incidents. And then finally, it's ISACA. We're going to talk about risk management, not only technology risk, but also the specific data risk as it relates to the private information. That will be covered as well in the domains of the common body of knowledge for this credential. Now we get into the solutions engineer component of that credential, and that has to do with privacy architecture. So determining that you have the proper infrastructure, software, applications, and the correct secure development lifecycle, and then the actual technical controls, diving into that at a very granular level is something that's going to be covered in this domain. So a very technology-driven, of course, is the offering. So technology-driven approach to making sure that knowledge is there. And then finally, making sure that you understand the entire data lifecycle throughout the whole thing. The purpose of the data, the quality of the accuracy. You heard Louis actually talking about validating and the value of private data increasing once it's been determined that that data was validated across your entire organization, validated at the inception, that you had permission, that you had acceptance, that you had communication of notification of the rights and requirements, and the right to audit and the right to forget, and those kinds of things. Increasing the value, understanding those kinds of implications is going to be covered in this certification. And then of course, persistence, right? Storage of the data, minimizing, reducing, managing, ultimately decycling and removing and purging from your environment. Understanding across these multiple domains is the thing that's going to be covered in this new credential. So you can see that it's comprehensive, you can see that it's a unique offering, you can see that this is something that is relevant, just as our panelists were describing, becoming more and more relevant to the marketplace every single day. So with that, we want to make sure that we give you the proper information, not only about this session. CPEs will be sent to you within the next 24 to 48 hours. We have your participation information. We know that you participated in this session, regardless of whether or not your poll functionality was working. We know you were here. You're going to receive those CPEs. Those will be sent to you electronically as usual. You can always find more information directly on our website, isacasfl.org. You, of course, can reach out to me directly. I'm Rob Valdez. I'm volunteering as the president of ISACA South Florida right now. My email is president@isacasfl.org. I look forward to all of your communications and your feedback, and we'll be sending this out to you very soon. With that, I bid you all great Friday. I thank very much the committee who put this whole thing together. Sandra, Joanne, Lynn, especially you who decided to participate in co-hosting this with us. And I wish everyone a great and safe weekend. Be well. We look forward to seeing you all very soon.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.